The sound was unholy, like a choir of demons being strangled, echoing through the chilly night air, loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. I jolted upright from bed, heart hammering against my ribs, but deep down I knew exactly what it was. My motion alarm had worked. And not just any alarm. The custom one I had installed specifically for her. The unmistakable chorus of goat screams signaled that Karen, my dear neighbor and self-appointed HOA tyrant, was back at it again, trying to cut the lock off my gate. The shrieking sounded like the gates of farm animal hell had flung open. I couldn't help but grin. By the time I threw on my jacket and hurried out the door, the scene was nothing short of spectacular. Karen, dressed head to toe in a ridiculous leopard print pajama set, was standing frozen like a raccoon caught in headlights. In one hand she clutched bolt cutters. In the other, a half-peeled neighborhood improvement sticker that she must have intended to slap on my gate after breaking in. Her mouth was hanging open, eyes wide as every single porch light within 2 blocks blinked on. Curtains rustled, doors creaked open, and sleepy neighbors stepped out with mugs of coffee or baseball bats, depending on their temperament. And through it all, the shrill cries of screaming goats blared like an apocalyptic soundtrack. I leaned against the fence post, crossed my arms, and watched Karen squirm. She stammered, trying to explain to the growing crowd that this was all a misunderstanding. Apparently, she had heard a distressed animal and was trying to help. A likely story, considering the bolt cutters in her hand and the fact that the distressed animal was an audio file I uploaded myself. Karen's husband, Greg, stood awkwardly behind her in slippers and a robe, silently mouthing apologies to anyone who would make eye contact. Greg, bless him, looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. As the goat screams finally died down, replaced by the awkward shuffle of neighbors whispering among themselves, Karen adjusted her pajama top and pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Your lock violates HOA guidelines," she snapped. "It's an eyesore." I knew the real reason, though. Karen had been after my property for months, ever since the HOA expanded its jurisdiction. And she hated that my little patch of land, barn and all, stood stubbornly independent right next to the neighborhood's manicured lawns and soulless flowerbed. But what made me suspicious tonight wasn't just the bolt cutters. As she argued about my lock, I noticed the way her eyes kept darting toward the old barn behind me. She wasn't looking at the lock. She was looking at the land. And that made my gut twist. What did Karen really want? The next morning, Karen wasted no time. An emergency HOA meeting was called, the fastest in neighborhood history. The clubhouse was packed, buzzing like a beehive as Karen took the floor and tried to paint herself as the victim. She pointed to blurry security footage that showed me terrorizing the neighborhood with unhinged farm animal sounds. She called it harassment, said I was disturbing the peace. The room broke into muffled laughter when someone asked if she had really been holding bolt cutters at the time of the alleged harassment. Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. I kept calm, sipping black coffee and letting her dig her own hole. I knew the HOA board, even the ones who usually bought into her nonsense, could see through the cracks. My property had been here for generations, way before the HOA even existed. I had every right to keep it locked, alarmed, and yes, serenaded by screaming goats if I wanted to. Still, I could tell Karen wasn't done. She didn't back down. She didn't apologize. Instead, she doubled down. When the meeting adjourned, Karen cornered me in the parking lot, eyes wild with rage. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "I'm not finished with you." I just smiled and tipped my hat. "Didn't sound like the goats agreed with you," I said before walking off. But as I turned to leave, I caught it again, that same glance toward my barn. Not at me. Not at the gate. At the barn. Something was brewing, and it wasn't just Karen's typical brand of HOA meddling. This wasn't about aesthetics or lock codes or even some petty neighborhood spat. Karen wanted something. And by the way her jaw clenched and her eyes narrowed as she stared past me, I knew this was only the beginning. Back home, I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the hills, the barn silhouetted against the twilight. I tried to shake it off as another Karen tantrum, but something wouldn't let me. Why had she risked being caught, humiliated, and ridiculed over a lock? Why now? As I sipped the last of my coffee, I promised myself one thing. The next time Karen tried something, I'd be ready. And knowing Karen, it wouldn't be long. Because if there's one thing Karen can't resist, it's other people's property. And if there's one thing I can't resist, watching her fail. Again. And again. And again. A few days passed, and for a while, it seemed like the goat alarm incident might have knocked some sense into Karen. The neighborhood went back to its usual rhythm. Kids playing basketball after school, retirees tending to their perfect lawns, and the occasional dog barking at squirrels like it was a full-time job. I almost allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally accepted defeat. But deep down, I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to give up, especially not when she had been publicly embarrassed. It was early on a Wednesday when I spotted them. Two men with clipboards and high-visibility vests walking the property line between my land and the neighborhood's manicured lawns. They didn't look like the usual utility workers. No logos on their vests, no parked work trucks, just a pair of guys with measuring wheels, GPS equipment, and the type of faces that said they were here for business, not repairs. I watched them from the porch, one eye on my coffee, the other on the slow, deliberate way they paced and measured. I didn't even have to ask. This had Karen written all over it. Later that afternoon, as if on cue, I saw Karen strutting down the street toward them with a Tupperware full of muffins, laughing and chatting like they were old friends. She didn't notice me watching as she pointed toward the barn and gestured as if outlining something grand. The men nodded, scribbled notes, and went right back to measuring. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a random inspection. Karen was up to something far bigger than an argument over a rusty lock. I grabbed my old county land records from the filing cabinet inside. The farm had been in my family long before HOA board meetings, manicured lawns, or plastic flamingos ever showed up. As I flipped through yellow deeds and faded maps, I noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to before, a survey marker tucked deep near the back corner of the barn, right where Karen had been pointing. My grandfather's notes mentioned it briefly, suggesting that the official property line might not have been clearly recorded when the neighborhood was first built. To anyone else, it would just look like part of the HOA's greenbelt, but I knew better. That patch of land, about a quarter acre, was mine. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept returning to the sight of Karen handing those men muffins like a mob boss, slipping hush money under the table. The next morning, I called my old friend, Rick, who happened to be the county's most stubborn and thorough land surveyor. Rick was the kind of guy who considered measuring landlines an art form, and I knew he'd jump at the chance to stick it to the HOA, especially Karen. Within hours, Rick showed up with his own equipment, whistling a tune and carrying 2 thermoses of strong black coffee. We spent the day re-examining the property, walking every inch of the fence, measuring twice, marking stakes, and comparing note. Sure enough, the corner behind the barn fell well within my property line, and more importantly, it wasn't included in the HOA's recorded map. It was my land, no question about it. Karen wasn't just making noise. She was quietly trying to stage a land grab. And with that small patch of land, I realized the HOA could technically reroute the neighborhood walking path and claim easement rights, opening the door for future development. Karen wasn't just being a busybody, she was orchestrating a full-on land snatch. That night, I set up more motion sensors and trail cameras around the barn, each one carefully hidden and all linked to my phone. I wasn't about to let Karen or her muffin-bribed surveyors pull a fast one. Sure enough, just past midnight, my phone buzzed. The motion alert wasn't from the gate this time, it was from the barn. I slipped out the back door, staying low behind the brush, and crept toward the flickering beam of a flashlight near the fence line. Karen stood there, clipboard in hand, squinting at the property marker Rick and I had flagged earlier. She scribbled something furiously before pulling out a bundle of plastic signs from her tote bag. One by one, she hammered them into the ground. They read, "Future site of HOA Community Garden by order of the HOA Board." I nearly laughed out loud right there. Karen had no authority to order anything, let alone put up signs on land that wasn't hers. But watching her tiptoe like a cartoon villain made me realize how far she was willing to go. I kept watching, careful not to give myself away, as she moved deeper onto the property, placing more signs, marking off imaginary borders with pink construction tape. The sheer gall of it would have been impressive if it wasn't so pathetic. She wasn't just acting without approval, she was banking on no one noticing until it was too late. My land, my barn, and my future were nothing more than pawns in whatever scheme she was cooking up with the HOA. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up to bright, cheery signs announcing the new community garden, courtesy of the HOA. Karen strutted around like a peacock, accepting compliments, pretending she was leading a selfless beautification project. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, playing the long game. If Karen wanted a war, I was going to make sure she had one, but on my terms. As neighbors gathered near the barn, admiring Karen's so-called generosity, I noticed something else. Karen wasn't just enjoying the attention. She was stalling. She kept glancing at her watch, nervously scanning the street. That's when I spotted a well-dressed man in a sharp suit leaning against a sleek black SUV parked near the entrance to the neighborhood. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't with the HOA. And judging by the smug look on his face and the expensive leather folder under his arm, I could only guess who he was: a developer. It clicked in an instant. Karen wasn't after a garden. She was after a payday. That little patch behind the barn was the missing piece to some larger project, and if she could snatch it without anyone noticing, she could deliver it on a silver platter to the developer in exchange for whatever dirty deal they had brewing. I clenched my jaw, watching as Karen shook the man's hand and pointed proudly at the signs. She thought she had won already, that no one would stand up to her because, after all, who would go against the HOA? But what Karen didn't know was that I already had the footage, the documents, and now, the motive. She had made a critical mistake. She underestimated me. And she had absolutely no idea what I was about to do next. By the next morning, I had the makings of a plan, and this time, I wasn't settling for just catching Karen red-handed. I wanted to make sure that when she went down, it would be with the entire neighborhood watching. I spent the better part of the day upgrading the goat alarm, but not just with louder sounds. I rigged it to project holographic images of stampeding goats, ghostly but realistic enough to make anyone jump out of their skin. It was a trick I'd learned from a local fairground that used the same setup for their haunted hayride. It wasn't hard to adapt, especially with some old projectors I had gathering dust in the shed. Combined with my trail cams, motion sensors, and a few hidden speakers, the setup was ready. Now all I needed was for Karen to take the bait. Karen, of course, was predictable as ever. That evening, I spotted her pacing near the newly posted, Future HOA Community Garden signs, phone pressed to her ear and gesturing wildly as she whispered to someone. My guess? The developer. Her body language said it all. She thought she was about to seal the deal. I let her stew for a few hours, knowing full well she'd come back under the cover of night to make sure everything was just right before she tried to file anything official with the county. Karen had always believed that darkness and silence were her allies. Tonight, neither would be on her side. Sure enough, just past midnight, the motion alert pinged on my phone. I slipped outside and circled around through the woods, careful not to disturb a single twig. I didn't want to spook her too early. When I finally got into position behind the old oak tree that gave me a perfect view of the barn, I saw her. Karen stood under the faint glow of her flashlight, bolt cutters in one hand, hammer in the other, prepared to swap out my property markers for ones of her own. In her tote bag were fresh signs, printed this time with more authority. Private HOA property, no trespassing, development approved. I held my breath and waited as she stepped right into the sensor's range. The second the beam detected her movement, all hell broke loose. A blood-curdling choir of goat screams erupted from every corner of the field, but this time, it was paired with the sudden appearance of ghostly holographic goats charging right at her from the woods. Karen shrieked like a horror movie extra and stumbled backward, tripping over her own toolbox and landing flat on her back. The holograms didn't stop. They circled and stampeded like a phantom herd, while the screams echoed so loudly that I was sure half the neighborhood would be waking up again. And wake up they did. One by one, porch lights flicked on and neighbors emerged in bathrobes and slippers, staring down at the barn where Karen flailed and scrambled to her feet, screaming about demon goats and witchcraft. She bolted down the path, leaving behind her hammer, bolt cutters, and the bag full of forged signs. I stayed hidden just long enough to see her trip one last time and roll into the ditch near the walking path. It took every ounce of willpower not to burst out laughing. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers of Karen's goat encounter spread faster than wildfire. Kids reenacted it with homemade goat masks, and someone even updated the community bulletin board with a drawing of Karen being chased by a herd of angry livestock. Karen, however, was nowhere to be found. She skipped the usual HOA patrol and avoided her morning walk, but I knew she wouldn't stay gone for long. The woman was stubborn, and besides, the developer wasn't going to wait forever. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around that weekend, the room was packed. More residents showed up than I'd ever seen. Karen tried to regain control, standing stiffly behind the podium, insisting that the neighborhood had been attacked by some prankster farmer, meaning me, and that swift action needed to be taken to stop this supposed harassment. I waited patiently, sipping bad coffee, letting her dig her own grave. When it was finally my turn to speak, I pulled out a USB stick and handed it to Linda, the board's secretary. The second the footage played on the projector, the room went dead silent. There, in glorious high-definition night vision, was Karen trespassing, hammering signs into the ground, bolt cutters in hand. Frame by frame, they watched her try to doctor my land like it was an abandoned lot, swapping out official markers, placing fraudulent signs, and waving flashlights around like she was on a treasure hunt. The crowning jewel was her encounter with the goat holograms. Laughter erupted as Karen's panicked face lit up the screen, flailing wildly as she ran from nothing but light and sound. Karen's face turned purple, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She pointed at me, stammering something about manipulated footage, but it was no use. Greg, bless his poor soul, slid his chair as far from her as possible, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. Then came the questions. Board members who usually backed her started asking things like, "Why were you placing unauthorized signs? And how did you get access to HOA funds for this supposed garden without approval? And who is this developer you've been meeting with?" Karen tried to maintain control, but the room had turned. Neighbors who once admired her tidy flower beds and strict HOA enforcement were now whispering and shaking their heads. Some were visibly furious. Others, especially the older residents, chuckled quietly, clearly savoring every second. The final blow came when the board president, usually one of Karen's staunchest allies, turned to her and said, "Karen, is there something you want to tell us about this developer?" Karen, flustered and cornered, blurted out, "The deal's already done. It doesn't matter now." Gasps echoed across the room. She had admitted it. She had cut a deal behind everyone's back, selling out the neighborhood to a developer who would pave over part of the community's walking path and green space for profit. In that instant, Karen realized her mistake. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked truly afraid. The president leaned back, arms crossed, and simply said, "We'll see about that." I didn't even have to say another word. The footage, the signs, the scheming, it was all there. Karen had walked right into the trap, goats and all. As the meeting descended into chaos, with neighbors demanding her removal from the board, Karen just sat there, frozen, watching everything crumble. And I knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't over yet. The real hammer hadn't even dropped. But it was coming. And Karen wasn't going to see it coming until it was far too late. The next few days were a strange blend of chaos and quiet, like the calm after a tornado, when you know another storm is coming but the sky looks deceptively clear. Karen had vanished from public view, skipping her usual power walks, HOA patrols, and even the Sunday Garden Club meeting, which was practically her church. Yet the developer's sleek black SUV was still parked near the neighborhood entrance every evening, engine running, like a shark circling its prey. I knew Karen hadn't given up. She was regrouping, desperate to salvage the deal. But I had already made my move. Earlier that week, after the HOA meeting blew up in her face, I had taken the footage, the survey results from Rick, and copies of the forged signs straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Daniels was a no-nonsense type, someone who still tipped his hat at folks and treated property rights like sacred law. He didn't need much convincing. The second he saw Karen swinging bolt cutters on private land and bragging about an illegal deal at a public meeting, he nodded slowly and said, "We'll handle it." From that moment I knew Karen's fate wasn't just going to be decided by angry neighbors, it was about to become a matter for the law. On Friday, just before sunset, Sheriff Daniels himself rolled up in his patrol truck and parked right at Karen's driveway, lights flashing for all to see. The neighborhood, like clockwork, started peeking through curtains and gathering on sidewalk. Karen stepped outside, wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that couldn't quite decide between defiant and terrified. Daniels wasted no time. He calmly informed her that there was an official complaint against her for trespassing, vandalism, attempted land fraud, and violating county development code. Karen stammered, turning toward Greg, who stood frozen in the doorway holding a casserole like it was a shield. What nobody knew was that the developer, realizing the heat was on, had already started backing away. Rick had quietly sent the corrected survey to the county planning office, making sure the land records were airtight and leaving no wiggle room for Karen's fabricated property lines. Without that corner of land behind my barn, the developer's project was dead on arrival. I had spotted him the night before driving out of town, looking as if he had seen a ghost, or worse, a herd of ghostly goats. Karen pleaded with the sheriff, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that she was acting on behalf of the HOA. Daniels simply raised an eyebrow and said, "Ma'am, we have you on camera." Karen's facade cracked like a dropped plate. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as she was issued a citation and warned that further action could be coming pending a formal review. Greg quietly slipped back inside, casserole still in hand, leaving Karen to face the music alone. The fallout was immediate. The board called for an emergency vote the very next morning, and with only 2 shaky hands raised in her defense, both of whom lowered them when met with glares, Karen was officially removed as HOA president. It was as if a spell had been broken. The tight-lipped board members who had once followed her lead like sheep suddenly found their voices, openly criticizing her for making backdoor deals and embarrassing the entire community. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up shared stories of Karen's petty fines, her threats, and the way she bullied anyone who dared question her authority. For the first time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people again. But I wasn't finished. Not quite yet. The following weekend, I organized what I dubbed the first annual Goat Parade, complete with hayrides, a barbecue, and yes, a guest appearance by a small herd of very real, very loud goats borrowed from my cousin's farm. I half expected the turnout to be small, maybe a few curious neighbors and some amused kids. Instead, the entire neighborhood showed up. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years laughed together as the goats trotted along the walking path wearing flower garlands and little banners that read things like "Karen Who?" and "We love our farmer." The atmosphere was electric, filled with the kind of joy that only comes when people realize they're free from the grip of someone who'd made their lives miserable for years. Even Greg showed up, standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, watching with an almost sheepish smile. He didn't say much, but the fact that he was there without Karen said enough. As the sun dipped behind the hills and the last goat was loaded back onto the trailer, I stood by the fence, looking out over the barn and the newly remarked property line. The projectors were packed away, the alarms switched off, but the land felt more mine than it ever had before. No HOA tricks, no phony signs, no Karen breathing down my neck. Just me, my land, and a community that had rediscovered its backbone. Before heading inside, I couldn't resist one last bit of mischief. I walked over to the gate, checked the lock, and then tripped the motion sensor on purpose. The familiar, ridiculous sound of screaming goats filled the air one last time, echoing across the fields. To my surprise, laughter erupted from nearby porches. Neighbors cheered, and someone even shouted, "Play it again!" I obliged. And in the distance, behind the curtains of the now strangely quiet house next door, I saw the outline of Karen staring out at the celebration she would never be part of again. For once, she didn't have anything to say. She just stood there, watching, powerless. The war was over, and I had won. Not with anger or threats. With goats. Just the way it should have been.